In the quaint town of Willowbrook, nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, there was an old, abandoned toy shop. The locals often spoke in hushed tones about the place, saying it was cursed. The shop had been closed for decades, ever since the owner, Mrs. Hawthorne, disappeared without a trace. But the real heart of the legend was a doll, a beautiful porcelain doll with eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, a curious young girl named Emma found herself standing before the shop's boarded-up windows. She had heard the stories, of course, but she was drawn by a strange sense of adventure. With a determined tug, she managed to pry open a loose board and slipped inside. Dust motes danced in the fading light as Emma made her way through the aisles of forgotten toys. There, in the center of the room, on a pedestal draped in a tattered velvet cloth, sat the doll. It was even more beautiful up close, with its delicate features and finely sewn dress. Emma felt an irresistible urge to pick it up. As her fingers wrapped around the doll, a chill ran down her spine. She shook off the feeling and examined the doll more closely. There was an inscription on the base. "To those who seek may you find, but beware the secrets left behind." Emma frowned, puzzled by the cryptic message. She decided to take the doll home, thinking it would be a perfect addition to her collection. That night, strange things began to happen. Emma was awakened by the sound of whispering. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and saw the doll sitting on her dresser, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. She could have sworn she left it in her toy chest. She brushed it off as her imagination and went back to sleep. But the next morning, Emma found the doll in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a teacup in its tiny hand. Her parents were bewildered, but Emma, remembering the stories, began to feel a creeping dread. She decided to return the doll to the shop that very evening. As the sun set once more, Emma hurried back to the toy shop, the doll clutched tightly in her arms. She placed it back on the pedestal and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that sent her sprawling. The room grew cold and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Emma spun around, and to her horror, the doll was no longer on the pedestal. It was standing on the floor, looking up at her with an expression that seemed almost alive. Panic surged through her, and she backed away, but the doll took a step forward. "You shouldn't have taken me," the doll said, its voice a haunting echo. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What do you want?" "To be free," the doll replied, its porcelain face twisting into a sinister smile. "But freedom comes at a price." The whispers grew louder, and the room seemed to close in on her. Emma realized she had to break the curse. She remembered the inscription and the stories of Mrs. Hawthorne's disappearance. Desperation drove her to grab the doll and dash for the door, which now opened easily. She ran to the town's old library, the whispers following her every step. There, she pored over ancient books and forgotten tomes, seeking an answer. Finally, she found it. The curse could only be lifted by returning the doll to its rightful place, deep in the heart of the forest, where Mrs. Hawthorne had found it all those years ago. With trembling hands, Emma made her way into the forest, the doll's weight growing heavier with each step. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her like skeletal fingers. She reached a clearing where an old, crumbling altar stood, covered in moss and vines. Placing the doll on the altar, Emma recited the incantation she had found. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. Just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, there was a blinding flash of light, and the whispers ceased. When Emma opened her eyes, the doll was gone, and the forest was silent. She stumbled back to Willowbrook, exhausted but relieved. The curse had been lifted. From that day on, the toy shop remained abandoned, but the stories of the cursed doll faded into memory. Emma never spoke of her adventure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the depths of the forest, the doll was waiting, biding its time, for the next curious soul to wander by.